Okay, I think everybody's here that's going to be here, so let's get started. Just a couple of little housekeeping things. Thomas reminded me that we hadn't mentioned a special issue that we have lined up for this. Some of the ways of sharing everything at the conference, as you've probably seen, has been through the video capturing. We also have the PowerPoints that we'll have ready and distributed online for people to see who couldn't attend the conference. And last time we had this conference, we had a special issue through Water Resources Research of a selection of papers from the presentations you saw during the week. So we're going to do the same thing. We're not sure exactly what journal it is. There's 2 or 3 that we're looking at right now. But just to keep in mind that those of you that have presented work, we'll be sending information out to you to try to encourage you to submit to that special issue, and we'll do the same thing and try to have a publication coming out from that. So that's just a heads up for that coming up. So we're going to start our final panel of the day, and glad to have all of you here that were able to stay. And just before I get started, I wanted to take a moment, because I'm not going to get another chance to do that, to acknowledge the work and effort that was that Tom Harder put in for this. I have to tell you, the amount of time he put in for it was unbelievable. So Thomas, thank you, buddy. Unbelievable. He spent a lot of personal and political capital, let me tell you, to get us to this stage. And just briefly, I know we've mentioned it before, but I just want to point out to Jennifer Bowles, Sue McClurg, and Beth Stern, and the rest of your team for a phenomenal job this week, and from the Water Education Foundation for getting this thing off the ground and keeping us going all week. So thank you so much for that. And the happiest people we're going to have in an hour and a half from now are going to be this group of students that stayed with us all week to run all the little sessions. If it hadn't been for them, we'd still be sitting in track A trying to get to the next presentation. So thanks to all the students for helping us out all week. It's awesome. Just awesome. All right, so much for that. Let me, a big honor for me to present to you our moderator for the afternoon, a very close personal friend and colleague for many years, Bernadette Conant. Many of you may know her. Bernadette is the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Water Network, an organization that plays a very vital role in facilitating linkages between the private sector, industry, government, NGOs in Canada, and academia in order to improve the application of water research into management decisions. She also serves as director on boards of the Global Water Research Coalition, Hydrogeologists Without Borders, and the Water Economics Policy and Governance Network, holds an MSc in Hydrogeology from the University of Waterloo. Where's that? Somewhere up there. And Bernadette also, I must tell you personally, is one of the most influential voices and tireless voices in Canada for promoting sustainable water management, frequently, probably far too frequently, sought out by stakeholders around the world in the water arena for advice and guidance. Thomas and I didn't agree on everything in this conference, but we did agree that Bernadette was the best to run our session at the end here. So, are you buying dinner? So, ladies and gentlemen, Bernadette Conant.
That's your first lesson in communication, is you can get a lot done when you flatter people. Well, it doesn't have to be totally true, it just has to be good. And Dave's, I have to tell you, is one of the best at that. So thanks, and good afternoon to everyone, and as always at these things, thank you for being here at the end. I've done these a lot, and I know how exhausting and how full everybody's brain is, but I find that these sessions are actually, it's like, keep it going to the end, because it's what gels in these discussions at the end that's really influential to what we do going forward. So I want to really appreciate the fact that you're there, and that you're here with us. And as Dave said in my introduction, I'm the CEO of something called Canadian Water Network. And the goal of Canadian Water Network, its basic raison d'etre, if you like, is to improve the way that research and knowledge is brought in the value of that knowledge to water management, just broadly. That's its goal. And the important thing to know, maybe we can talk after if people are interested in mechanistically how we do that. It's one of the things we do are these kinds of conferences. But the important thing to understand is our sort of philosophy about how we go about that task. And it may seem subtle, but it's not. And that is the fact that our view is that science and research doesn't ever, or very rarely, tell us what to do. That's not its role. It informs decisions. And the decisions themselves, so when we sort of nuance this idea of science-based decision-making, we actually prefer the term science-informed decision-making, because most decisions, almost all decisions, they're political, whether that's small p or big P, and they're value-based. And the role of science broadly is really to inform that decision. And the reason that that subtle distinction is important, because it informs everything we do at Canadian Water Network, and what I describe as a pull frame rather than a push. So it's not about representing the collective academic community and saying, this is what's so important about what they do and you need to hear it, which is actually what happens a lot in the attempts to kind of do science push. So it's really about standing in the position of the decision frame. We actually spend most of our time actually in that what's the question, actually figuring out and framing the question. And when that's clear, you get a clearer idea to what science knowledge do we want to pull, because it has the ability, the capacity to inform that decision. So just sort of keep that in mind, that framing really runs through everything we do. And I want to say that from somebody who lives that in an organization day to day, I feel fully qualified to tell you that this event is excellent in terms of the way that it's organized. And I go to many of them, and I want to give kudos to Thomas and to Dave and to the whole organizing committee, because you've achieved what I get rewarded for when we do it well in our conferences, and that is creating, not telling you what you have to know or making sure you're educating. There are lots of training, education courses, but it's actually creating the venue, where the way that the panels are structured and the sessions are structured and the distribution of the people that are brought to you actually engenders that understanding of much of the discussions I heard in the sessions, and I was listening for it, was really about what the questions were and the relevance of the science to the questions. So my hat's off to you, because I live that. It's my soapbox, but it's more of that kind of thing that we need to get done in order to answer the questions that many of you had. It's not about how do we get farmers to do something. It's not how do we get scientists to do something. It's how do we engage with them and get them engaged in a way that we collectively move forward. So I want to congratulate you in doing that. And then also then really thank you very sincerely. As I said, it's a real privilege, and I mean that sincerely, quite an honor and a privilege to be able to play this role. It's a real privilege to actually be able to, just, as I said, to show up and be able to have a great panel delivered and participate in this rather than designing it. So to you folks, thanks again. It's a real honor, and I thank you. So for this session, there are going to be no PowerPoints, not a lot of talking at you. It's really a facilitated discussion. It's sort of a culmination of an event. It's really formalizing the kind of discussion that you've been having around coffee and in sessions all week. And because I told you about my sort of philosophy of wanting to have the right sort of mix of perspectives, and it's not about having everybody at the table. It's about having a Delphi effect. It's about having a coalition of the willing that's got a broad perspectives that move us forward. You'll see why the panel that was designed for this event and delivered to me, thankfully, is really an excellent one in my mind, and I had the privilege to speak with them a little bit before to talk about this session. And so I think all of you have in your packages the bios. I'm not going to read everybody's bio. I'm going to just introduce really briefly who we have up here and tell you why I think that it's such a good mixture of this perspective. So start with Jean-Pierre Cataviela. JP, I listened to him give a talk in the other room, and so I'm going to preempt any attempt he has to do self-deprecating humor and tell you that, sorry, usually I'm too loud, so let me know if I'm not talking into this well enough. Because if you look at his bio, he's the president of Cogent Consulting and Communications, and that communications part in my mind is actually what makes him the most qualified to be here in this discussion, because it's really about understanding the context and communicating. As I've said to others, as Dave would have heard many times, my most off phrase in Canadian Water Network to the researchers used to be, honey, it's all really relevant, but it's not actionable. And then it doesn't matter. My new phraseology, I had to drop the honey because apparently that's not socially acceptable, but it's a Canadian thing. We're nice, we love everybody, this way it is. And so actually now my new sort of working title line, I think I'm going to put on a t-shirt, is it doesn't matter if you're 150% right if nobody believes you. So it's a fundamental role about if we're going to use good science and research and decision making, good science and leading science, that's table stakes. But it really doesn't matter how good and relevant or even actionable it is if people don't believe you. So I want to stress that this role of understanding and communicating effectively, so you even get at the table to have this done, is really key. So I would highlight from that bio, before he gets to the self-deprecating part, so I've stalled you there, is the fact that he's received the awards listed are for that interaction between environment and communicating things well. So I want you to seek these kind of people out for those of you in doing more of this in your career, because they're really key. So welcome, JP. Bill Alley, I would say for many here, needs no introduction in terms of being such a wealth of information. He says he's retired from what was his day job. He's one of those retired people who don't really seem all that retired to me. For the chief of the Office of Groundwater for the USGS, I had the great honor and privilege of serving on the board for 6 years with him in National Groundwater Association and the what was then the Association of Groundwater Scientists and Engineers. I think I got that right. And based on his bio and knowing him, I think he's got more than the equivalent of my kids' soccer awards trophy case at home in terms of the awards given to him. And I always think it's pretty interesting that when you're still going, that you've already got 2 lifetime awards. I don't know if that's a reward or they're telling you, you need to, yeah, like, whew. But again, I want to highlight that among those, so we already all know him as a technical expert and extraordinaire. But the award I'd highlight on here is the Shoemaker Award for Lifetime Achievement in Communication. So in this field, when you're not coming out as a communications expert, that's no small feat and important. He's also, he and his wife are authors of the 2013 book, if you haven't read, Too Hot to Touch, about the management of the nuclear waste issue. You should get it. And I have to put in a plug, in 2017, they have a new book coming, High and Dry, and I've forgotten the second part.
The world's growing dependence on groundwater.
Right, so, go to Amazon or wherever it is you go to order it before it's out. I highly recommend it. So thanks, Bill, and welcome. Cameron Hawley is joining us from University of New South Wales in Australia. And I want to highlight, so lots of things there in the bio, and a prestigious scholar, and on all these things. I don't think I'm really active and passionate, but I feel like quite the underachiever when I read many of these. But one of the important things about the perspective that that Cameron has or represents in this discussion that we heard in day one about the social scientists. And in Canada, we always talk about the hard sciences and the harder sciences, being the social sciences. And to stress that this is not just economics and geography. So with our group, they all thought they needed an award because they put a token geographer and economist, like, see, I have a shirk, that's our granting council, a social scientist. It's about the broad expertise is just as important in economics and law and ethics, and that's really what Cameron's brought to this discussion. That's so important in this, both from a scholarship point, and to say that that's as important from a scholarship point of view as it is in the context. These are human issues, they're economic issues, as much as they are technical issues. So for those of us who tended to start and get funded for, and these kinds of organizations have tended to come from the technical background. So to sort of evolve to a recognition that it's not about tokenism or communications, what you do on the end. Communications, what you do first. Without humanities and law and economics, these pieces, the rest of the technical stuff doesn't really matter. So we've really tried to move to a place where we've put that in the right context. So Cameron, thanks for being here with us and bringing that. And lastly, Karen Vilhoff, who we met in the plenary earlier, so you're already aware that she brings such a wealth of information and a global dimension and perspective. She's originally from Denmark, and for those of you who know that the Danes, especially on the drinking water side, and I think for even agriculture, 100% dependent on groundwater. So they've been in the lead in a lot of this work. And I know we've got lots of our Dutch friends, and so there's always competition about, we've been dealing with water, and at surface water events, the Dutch usually sort of rise to the top, but I'm going to put it out there that from a groundwater, I have to tell you, from my perspective, the Danes have been one of the leaders in this work. With IMWI, with the International Water Management Institute, she's now located in Pretoria, and she brings a focus on the developing country context, and that's where I want to sort of kick off. Of course, we're sitting here in California. The issues in California with Sigma and the drought really push the relevance of groundwater management for agriculture, but it's that sort of national perspective of developing as well as developed countries that's really important. So I think you'll agree with me, you've got quite the wealth of experience up here to do what I've said, and that's not to tell you what the answers are or to dictate to you, here's the solution. That's up to the rest of you to decide as a group, but to bring perspectives to this. So what we're going to do is just basically conduct the rest of this session as a discussion, armchair discussion, and we're going to start with the panel here discussing and making some comments among themselves, and then we'll turn it to the participants. And I've really boiled it down. We had a discussion earlier. There's sort of 3 key questions, and we're going to try to keep the remarks brief and do it in rounds, but I'm quite flexible as to sort of how we go through them. But the basic 3 questions are, so for 3 of our 4 panelists were here at the last event, which may feel like last year, but 2010. So let me tell the younger folks, the older you get, the faster stuff goes, because every day is a smaller percentage of your entire lifetime. So just blink and it'll be the next one. So one of the questions is, what you've seen change since the last event and the discussion that we had here. And then secondly, and building on that, I would like each of you to talk about, and you can decide whether you want to start with this or add it in, with all these talks, what would you say is your biggest sort of aha moment or theme that you saw or heard here, and or conversely, because you're bringing such a wealth of experience from other places, what are the things that you're surprised that you didn't hear? And I find that revealing, because I'm sure many of you have been in overlapping conversations, so what didn't you hear? And I hope I should have warned the participants, the audience, to be listening to this, because these are the same questions. So if anybody has questions at the end, we'll have some question, but it's not an opportunity for you to stand up and tell the room what you think they needed to hear from this. You have to answer the same questions. And this last one is particularly aimed at you, and that is, we talked a lot about self-organizing. This is a self-organizing group. The organizers for this event have done a lot, but I go to many of these and people want to know what the next steps are. Let me tell you, there's nobody in this room who has got a paid mandate to make sure next steps happen. But everybody in this room wants next steps to happen. And the only solution to that is to identify what the opportunities are for self-organizing groups like this to do things. So that I'm looking from the panel and from the group here is, what's the biggest opportunity that you see for things that can happen leaving this room, whether it's something you do yourself or others. And they can be suggestions on things that you want to organize, but nobody owns this but you collectively, and so that's an important piece. So with those, I think we'll start a little bit with our panel, with some of the comments, and maybe I'm going to ask Bill to start off, because I know he made notes. No, JP, did you say you want? No, I'm kidding. He's like, yes, I don't have to go first. And maybe either, you can start off just maybe a few comments, Bill, but either of those first questions, maybe, because I know you were here last time, your sort of key observation or observations on what's changed, and depending on how much time you want to spend on that, maybe what you saw of either a key aha that kind of hit you, or one that you were surprised that you didn't hear.
Okay. Yeah, I was here in 2010, and I remember very distinctly in 2010 how it was a little embarrassing to be from California, because speaker after speaker from outside California got up, and the first things they would say is, I can't believe you guys don't manage groundwater here. And then they'd tell us what they were doing around the globe, and that's obviously changed. I think at this point we're all tired of hearing about California, probably. So that's changed a lot. There was a global perspective, and I think really the organizers deserve a lot of credit. We in the United States think we're holding an international meeting if we have somebody from Canada or Mexico that shows up. And we're really proud of
It
ourselves.
is still international.
We
If we
pat
come,
ourselves-
just
Yeah.
saying.
And we may have trouble with Mexico in the future, so.
We haven't built the wall yet, but we're thinking about it. Just
Yeah. Actually, the Canadians are going to make the U.S. pay for a wall, I believe. But so I've been looking at Vancouver. It looks pretty nice. What's changed here too is the invitation to the ag community, which is really fantastic because personally I have never been to a meeting before where I've had quite the same interaction and hearing from those perspectives, and that's really great. So I think we need to try to find a way to do more of that. I don't know if I had an aha moment. I think one of the things that was interesting is we've made some progress in determining the extent of groundwater depletion, contamination around the world. I know where the hot spots are, but I don't really know, I couldn't say really how bad the situation is. I've kind of heard some of the optimistic stuff, and I've heard some pessimistic stuff, and I know India's got a challenge. I know we've got a challenge in the Central Valley. We got a challenge in Saudi Arabia and so forth, but I don't have there's probably that whole rest of the world it's in between these arid and semi-arid areas that we probably need to spend a little more time learning about what the situation is here. I heard, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly changes in agricultural efficiency, what effect that really does have on groundwater. It obviously has some good effects and then there's the questionable effects. So I think as hydrogeologists, we all need to pay a lot more attention to sort of what's going on in the whole in the sort of technology and what's going on in agriculture. I was surprised I guess I saw some remote sensing, and maybe there were in some of the sessions I had, but I think remote sensing really is a big area in trying to deal with agriculture because of it's one tool you have to look at trying to estimate water use, which is a key variable, and I think a lot of talks here focused on that water use. The lack of information on water use is really a stumbling block to us. So with that, I'll just pass the microphone and
that's great. Thank you.
join in later.
JP, I think I'm going to start with those of you who were here last time. I think you were here in 2010, so we'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you. When I came to the conference in 2010, it was my first time coming to any kind of a conference like this, and it was very helpful to me. At the time, I had been tasked with doing something that seemed impossible, and that was that we were going to have some sort of a monitoring program for all 1,400 dairies in the California Central Valley, and we were trying to figure out how that was all going to go. And fortunately, I have very, very good hydrogeologists that designed the program, but I was trying to figure out how I was going to get farmers to organize and pay for all of this. And what was very nice then, and what I remember very much, was going around and being able to talk to people from other countries, Italy, Denmark, the Netherlands, personally about what they did and how they had put together their monitoring programs. And it gave me some confidence that we could do it here. Being back 6 years later, wow, 6 years.
I know. Doesn't get any better like it does. Sorry.
Yeah, I have more grandchildren now, what strikes me, a couple of things strike me. The first is that I'm amazed at how much we've actually done in the 6 years since we were here, and how many people in the room have informed the decisions we've made. I can see your faces all around there. Some of them I didn't even speak in the conference, but they've played big roles in California. So a lot has happened, and then I guess the other sort of we're consciously shifting our focus right now from characterization. It doesn't mean we're going to stop characterizing the problem, but to trying to now address it more. And so what I think was missing here for me is more more presentations, more thoughts about successfully actually addressing the problem. I did feel like the level of our ability to characterize the water shortages and the things that are needed to happen is amazing. I mean, I can't believe the type of science that's been brought from every direction for this. And what I'm hoping now is that we can turn more of our attention to how we actually make it better. And I'm sure, and I don't mean to paint it as though we're not, but that's where I'm hoping when I come back in 6 years that we're going to have a bunch of presentations about how much progress we've made on these issues and how we're applying the technologies to characterize our improvement as opposed to just characterizing the situation that we're in. So I think that's all I'll say right now.
That's great. So I'll ask Karen, and to say, those of you, as we were mentioned, the recent publication, the PNAS publication, was mentioned a couple of times. And so for those of you in the communication space, so whether the tires are kicked on the science or the intent or not, and in defense of scientists who get things published, you have to those of you who don't do it, you have to understand that people that write the headlines are not the people who interview them. There are a whole set of people who write headlines who are good at it, like Twitter, in terms of getting your attention. So what we see is you see, and I won't say media, I say people, like from media, disaster stories, or amazing things like, oh my God, there's 3 times as much groundwater under California, problem solved. And so one of the things I would say and charge this group with is, I hear a lot that we need more success stories, but we have to be clever about it, because people don't like to just, other than, amongst ourselves, people don't like to publish, oh, it's not a problem, it's a good thing. So there's a real opportunity to kind of bring some of these sort of the amazing pieces forward, and don't be shy about what's amazing about it. So think in terms of headlines, and I think we can get some of those forward. Sorry, Karen, just trying to buy you a little time there to think. And
no, it's fine. Thank you. Well, maybe I can start from a broader perspective, looking back 6 years and up to now. I see that there's even more attention to groundwater now, broadly speaking. Not only in agriculture, but more broadly. And that's, of course, coming to the fore because of the increasing problems that we see. And California is only one example of that. So I think that's a good part about it, that the message is kind of getting out there. There's more attention to it, and we can ride on that groundwater wave in a way. That's what I'm trying to do anyway. To use that attention to also address the problems from many different perspectives. Sort of looking at the conference as such, and seeing any difference from 6 years ago. Maybe I see more countries represented. Thomas, you can probably fill me in on the data, but I see many different countries represented. I see also an increasing multidisciplinarity in the way that we look at the problems. So the hydrogeologists are not necessarily the most represented here. Maybe that was more the case back 6 years or before that. So we increasingly acknowledge that we have to come together to solve these problems. We cannot just look at it from one side, and I think that's very much required. Also, in terms of looking at the global aspects, I think that you are in a way in a very good position here in California, because you have such a concentrated amount of knowledge sitting actually in this room, and more broadly also, to address these problems, to come up with data, to come up with smart solutions, smart technology, and so on. But if you look around in other countries, that's really not the case. And with the same kind of problems, you can imagine what that will create in the future, because there's not the capacity out there that is required to address the problems in India and so on, Africa, North Africa, where you have similar overdraft problems and so on. And there's a huge risk there that the agenda will be taken over by politicians or by other people, and it's not going to be science-based or evidence-based as we would like to, and that's what you were pointing to. And so there's a big risk, I think, that things will not be solved, and it will be a huge struggle, and it will have consequences, I think, socially and environmentally. But I think we have to come together, and that's why we have these kind of gatherings. So understanding what are the approaches that we can use and spread the message and sort of multiply ourselves in a way. But also saying that if to the extent that we can bring out or we can expand our knowledge beyond where we work, and that's actually how I see my role is trying to increase the knowledge in developing countries around groundwater, and bringing more people on board, and also bringing in people from the developed countries, and using the capacity to kind of multiply the knowledge base, and also catching the attention and the interest of young people like students and so on to work in developing countries on some of these issues. I think there's a huge potential there, and to the extent that we can do that, I think we should think about it, collaboration between universities, between institutions like mine, EMEA and others, to really increase the critical mass around some of these problems. So I think I'll stop with that.
That's great. Thank you. Cameron.
So I wasn't here either in 2010, but I was thinking about where I was. And I was at I think the first Australian groundwater conference then. And we had Robert Glennon, who is from America, speaking to us and telling us about kind of why we needed to act on groundwater. And that got me thinking that I think what's changed in the last 6 years from the kind of policy legal perspective is we've kind of shifted from that idea that we need to do something, if you were California, or that we have a law but it's kind of in the early stages to, shit, we've got to actually implement this thing and make it work in practice. And I think you can see that in the discussions we've had here and also in broader kind of policy rhetoric. So the GEF, IAH and FAO have been looking for kind of best practice examples of groundwater governance internationally. We've heard discussions about what to do about the Water Framework Directive and kind of its lack of success or kind of middle-of-the-road success. And it's true also in Australia that, you know, we've been doing this for 24 years, but we still haven't kind of cracked it. And there's a real attention now on making implementation effective. And to me, I think that's what we've seen change in the last 6 years. In terms of the aha moment, I think mine, unfortunately, was probably on the first day, but the rest of the days were still interesting. And that was something that I think his name was Walter Ward, who I happened to sit next to, and he was talking about Sigma was a generational change. And I think that's true, to kind of put a positive spin on what Karen is saying. I think it's true of law policy in the water space in particular, more generally. So it's political, there's going to be conflict, it's very difficult. When I moved from kind of general environmental policy into the water space, I was shocked at how difficult it is to get change to occur. And so I think it is going to take time, and it's an evolution in policy, not just for Sigma, but for all groundwater law and policy. Again, true in Australia for 20-odd years of trying to get reforms, and it's constant iterative adjustment year by year. And that kind of leads me to, I guess, are we talking about what we should have heard? So the one thing maybe I didn't pick up was discussions about kind of learning, and I don't mean that in kind of an adaptive management sense or learning from each other, but kind of a broader policy and governance learning. So one of the successes of Australia is the National Water Commission, which we no longer have, but it was independent. It didn't have any powers, but its job was to share information about what each state was doing, how successful they were, And that has a number of advantages. One is it can provide accountability, albeit with no kind of penalty, but it also helps generate innovation and share learning and best practice. And for me, globally, there's an opportunity to do that. But in the case of California in particular, if you have 100-odd laboratories out there doing different things and nobody's sharing information between them, then progress is going to be a lot slower. So I would look for more discussion around that.
Great. Thanks for that. And I just wanted to play off the one comment that you made, a couple comments you made at the beginning that really resonate, and I wonder if they do for others here, is both the idea of generational change. So for those of you who are working, and most of us are in one fashion or other, whether it's students or your young professionals, they're much more adaptive to the nature of the change of the challenge. So I've often say to people people talk about my own role, it's been 14 years of change management. So if you want to read the literature and how to do what I do, it's not about being a hydrogeologist, it's about understanding what happens with change management. And those of us of an older generation, whether there are lots of movements where if your conversation starts with, we've been trying to do this for 20 or 30 years and it hasn't changed, if you haven't fundamentally changed the way you're doing it, either you haven't recognized that, one, you're not successful, or recognized the landscape that you're moving in calls for change. So I think that's a really important piece. It is about most of the issues I tell people in water, with apologies to my engineering and technology friends, the vast majority of issues we have around water management have nothing to do with absent science or absent technology. That's not to say that it doesn't improve them. It's just the fundamental shifts that we're looking at are about culture change and about how we use that knowledge. They're not about the one game-changing thing in terms of technology that changes them. So thanks for that. I think for maybe during the comments period others can say, but that very much resonates for me, Cameron, that it's really about changing that piece. So let's have another go around, and I'll start again with Bill because he's had the time to listen. And you can have a choice, and you can either ask one of your fellow panelists a question or as a follow-up, some thought that's triggered by that, or you can give us your thought on what you think the biggest opportunity is. And it has to be pragmatic and practical and something that people can do, but something that you'd like to see people take on. So you can, if you're really keen, you can do both, but you get to pick either a question or a comment on what you think the real opportunity is going forward.
Okay. So I guess I'd ask a general question of my partners here, which is, how do we avoid crisis management in groundwater? It seems like
there's a beer in it for you if you got this one.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. But I mean, it seems like people don't recognize the problem until it's gotten to a fairly severe state. So how do we get all those places where they're developing groundwater now and getting in the early stages? What's the best advice that you could give them in terms of how to avoid that crisis management?
I don't know.
Is that an acceptable answer?
Not only is it an acceptable answer, but it's an honest answer which is heard too few times. So the basis for figuring out how to go forward is actually starting with what you know and don't know. And I think that's so I'm interested in whether Karen or Cameron have comments on that. But it's a fundamental issue, and it's to put a point on it. I asked a couple of people over the last couple of days in California. I said, okay, so take Sigma, because that was the discussion was about. Would that have happened if it wasn't Jerry Brown, Governor Brown? Would it happen if it was Arnold Schwarzenegger? I really want to do the accent, but I got to stop myself. You have no idea what Canadians think about that ability to make fun of certain things. But anyway, back to the point. And I got mixed reactions, but not and asked for a few other things. Would it happen? But universally, when I asked the question, would it have happened without the drought? Most people said no, or basically the drought happening was the thing that makes it happen. So I think it's not an uncommon observation and those from Australia and Israel and now California and the Okanagan Valley or southern Alberta can tell you it's when your back's up against the wall. And I'm using drought examples, but or where that's top of mind, but flooding and other water management, like we've talked about, and subsidence being important are important. But it's been observed that it's really, as much as we like to think that we're motivated and organized around aspirational and long-term goals, it really has been one of crisis management. And so I guess I'll pass it to Cameron because I think he's got some thoughts. The only observation I would make is one that's not new, is that the old adage of never waste a good crisis, is that crisis management in and of itself isn't great, but if we practically recognize that human nature pays attention to that, look at how much companies and everybody else spends to get attention, to get clicks, to get things these days. So they're the one silver lining of crises are you have a sort of a ready audience. So I guess that would be my sort of one thought on that, is a crisis is a time to make the biggest progress.
Yeah, so I would echo that. I think that's spot on, Bernadette. It changes incentives and motivation, and so certainly Australia's used that quite effectively. And so what I would then suggest is, to avoid the crisis, you've got to replace that incentive that's created by the crisis with something else, and whether that's money or whether that's a good leader that can bring people along and explain to them why change is important, or kind of the communication that occurs through not necessarily conferences like this, but what can come from conferences like this, and kind of what goes on Twitter and educating the public about being more aware about the risks that come along. The other comment I would make is there's kind of crisis, and then there's bigger crisis and even more extreme crisis. So certainly Australia was in a crisis, and we use that to our advantage, but arguably we still have somewhat of a crisis. We've still got a lot of basins that are over-allocated, but we're better placed to address that sort of crisis than we were previously. So again, don't waste a crisis, but you're probably preventing a much worse crisis later on.
Right, and I think the challenge is you don't want to waste a crisis, but we don't want to actually think that crisis management is the way to manage. And there's a lot of social science that will tell you, after so many times of saying the sky is falling, people stop caring. So I don't want to say that our thought is that you need to seize that as the message. It's just that's the window to provide, here's an alternative. So I don't know, Karen, did you want to add, Ed, or go to your next question or observation?
No, I can probably add a little bit. So from my perspective, I'm thinking maybe in the Danish context here. In Denmark, we don't have problems with overexploitation as such. It's mostly a water quality problem, and I think we heard from Anker this morning. And you wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis, but it's something that we're constantly struggling with, water quality issues and getting a stabilized situation in terms of these things. And it's I think what I have learned from, viewing this over a number of years is that it's like it's a crisis that comes and goes. It's not like we have a crisis and then it goes away and we solve the problem. And I think we have to look increasingly into the future about at these kind of recurrent crises, and they will be more and more recurrent with climate change and with population increase and so on. So we just have to be prepared all the time and be at the forefront, proactive and so on to address these issues. Because it's not like we can solve the problem and then relax and think, okay, we did it, we've solved it, we've done it. No, because it's not going to be like that. So I think that's kind of probably the mindset that we have to use going forward. And it's going to be things that will change with not only the climate and population and so on, but also very much the political environment. I think that's what we've seen a lot in Denmark, so it goes up and down, whether we get funds for implementing environmental protection and so on. And similarly, I think also here in California, sometimes the political environment is good for implementing things, other times it's not. So you also have to see those windows of opportunities, not just a drought, but also a political kind of window to do things, and then use that to be upfront with some of the crises that are going to be constantly coming. And hopefully the political environment will keep being good sometimes and not just going down, because then we are really in deep problems.
JP, did you have either an observation you wanted to make or a question, or I can get you a glass of water?
I might need the glass of water. I still don't know. I will say this about being proactive. And I don't normally make comments where I'm not proposing something to do about it, but my observation is that for 20 years I've been listening to clients who are in the middle of a crisis asking, why aren't we being more proactive about these issues? Why are we waiting for someone else to come in and make decisions for us? A big part of our strategy has always been to put our clients at the table, to recognize what the issues are, and then to invest and investigate solutions so that they are part of the decision-making process. They will never control it entirely. Society's bigger than anyone, but they will have a lot more to do. And when I've been most successful, we've actually accomplished that. That was part of the argument to, for example, forming the Central Valley Dairy Representative Monitoring Program. We didn't have to do it, but folks understood that and stepped forward and did something. Now, at the same time, there have been many, many other proactive efforts that just have not been successful. And I scratch my head because it's like, wow, we're trying to do what you say you want, which is be proactive, but a lot of times folks are just afraid to step forward and actually be proactive. They're afraid for a lot of reasons, liability, admitting that they're causing a problem, that kind of thing, and that's a fairly difficult thing to deal with in the types of topics that we're addressing at this conference. But I just think we have to keep trying to make it clear, that that's the better approach than waiting for the crisis. But I very much appreciate the comments about making use of that crisis when it is at hand.
Thanks for that. JP, one of the things I would say that I also hear in these discussions is something that I'm in discussions a lot, in that I find that both the concepts of innovation and sort of the business metaphors are really helpful, because as I think JP and others mentioned earlier, that you have to better highlight when things have worked. But there are all these examples where things don't work and fail. And let me tell you, in the world of business, if you don't fail, you're not trying hard enough. So this idea that things don't always work in of itself isn't a failure, it's a learning. And I find that the community that works in these kind of things is so every community has this culture, but around water management, is always talking about the lack of leadership, and folks, government is us, right? We have representative, and we drive economy and have things to do, but it's about, like, either you're going to try or you're going to give up. Right? I heard a lot about how complicated it is in California and how the law is worse here, and really it is, but it's hard everywhere. So either we kind of go forward and try to figure out, and you won't be successful without failing. So I'd like to see us a little less afraid of talking about it doesn't always work. And I heard actually some good talks here about the lessons that learn in failure. But in the innovation space and in the innovation world, you go all the way to sort of angel investors and venture capitalists. There's an expectation that 9 times out of 10 you will fail, and there's an expectation of going into that. So I think that, again, I would say generationally, I would say there's an easier transition to grasping that with the up and coming and their generation. So I would like to see as much. I think one of the TICE conferences I suggested, Bill, that we should do was that everything we learn from failure, that you weren't allowed to talk about success, but. Do you have any more sort of comments or questions on that?
I'll comment on that. So I was at a meeting last week on Managed Act for Recharge, and one of the papers I remember most was somebody who gave a talk, and then at the end of the talk, then this is at the International Symposium on Managed Act for Recharge, she said, well, I guess I have the anti-MIR talk. because she had concluded that managed aquifer recharge was not the appropriate approach in this particular instance. And we don't hear, people don't tell enough of those kinds of stories about how you really worked and you threw everything into it, and then it wasn't really the right approach. And I think that's a very useful thing to hear about. Particularly in the remediation area, by the way. I think we really need to hear a lot more stories about what didn't work in remediation.
Right, and using the remediation, and that's been a lot of my world too, is an important one, because the expectations are in those conversations that when you do this sort of post-mortem, it's why the technology didn't work. And what I heard a little more of at this conference, and I would encourage you to push at other conferences, most of the time, what should be explored was the goal set wrong? Is that what we found out? That we set the wrong goal because we were trying to get to AMI, or what, or did we invite the wrong people, or omit inviting somebody we needed? Like, I see less of that kind of look, and it's not about. It's the philosophy, if you do the 5 whys, well, the technology failed. Well, why did it fail? Well, why did that happen? Well, and you sort of like look for root causes. So I want to say in an encouraging way, I heard more of that at this discussion, at this meeting, and I think that's an important part of this sharing is it's what did we learn from the process? Why couldn't we get people to come along? I actually think the learnings of Powerful, why didn't an attempt to get something to play out in a setting where we needed people to come to the table and agree is actually probably be more useful in the world that we live in, sort of bang for the buck, than what's right and wrong about the technology. Right and wrong, technologies are not unimportant, but like the market, if you set the goals right, they will eventually sort themselves out, because there'll be a competition among academics or a competition among providers in the market. If I would say if you had to do one thing, is just set that target. So any last sort of comments or questions you want to ask each other before we turn it to the general group here? Thoughts? All right, so you get your turn. So you have to you can ask questions about some of the comments that made. The only thing I would ask is make yourself think about what the question might be, what your aha moment is, what you didn't hear, or what you see the opportunity is. We're not looking for sort of statements about what you think people need to hear from you, and that's challenging. Speaking as the pot calling the kettle black, that's challenging, but it's what is it you heard, what's the thing you learned, or that's missing, or what do you think the opportunities? Those are your choices. So who's brave? Who's going to take that on? If you don't put any hands up, then I'm going to look at you all, and you're going to, well, we all just want to talk about what we want to talk about. So it's a bad thing not to ask a question.
I guess this is the category of maybe what's missing regarding thinking about avoiding the crises. And I think it's useful to look at it in terms of water supply and water demand. And here this comment's in context of water quantity, not water quality. Water quality, that's a whole other animal, but maybe I'll say something about that. But the places where water management seems to have been successful, they've had a good characterization of the supply, and a lot of people here really work on supply. What is it, and how transparent can we make it? What threatens it? But that's not enough. You also have to have some lever for controlling demand. And the places where they seem to have had both, they have a good knowledge of their system, and everyone sort of agrees, how it operates. And they have an economic lever for controlling demand. And the other part of demand, of course, is it's very social science oriented, and the research on social science and water is really in its infancy. So I think there's a lot more development to go on there. I could talk about water quality, which is this creeping normalcy problem that's almost impossible to motivate people to connect cause and effect and do much about it. But that's another matter.
Great. Any thoughts or responses from our group at the front here?
I agree on the need for more social science research.
So we can play off that, or are there other we can come back to that, other questions?
Regarding opportunities, I think climate change and that in many locations people want to adapt to climate change can be a way to talk about many other issues that are non-sustainable. And they may open up, old fights, where, things had always been a problem and people didn't want to talk about it anymore. Now there's no more this external threat of climate change. And that can be used possibly as an opportunity to, be more resilient with respect to climate change and so solve other issues.
So the idea being in the, let's say English, the North American context, nothing unites so well as a common enemy, that it's the common pressure that people recognize, and that it's a reason to kind of recognize you have to get together to figure out the solution.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Interesting. Great. Thoughts on that from our panel? On the role of climate change as a enabling factor as opposed to political
It depends
freebie?
on where you are in the United States. So they don't believe in climate change in Texas, I'm told.
Don't get, I know.
But so I think it is. I think it is a great motivating factor in general for various areas. But you have to be careful with it because the words climate change actually aren't used in some places still.
I think outside the United States generally not a problem.
Yeah. So it's only a particular area of the United States. But I think it is a good suggestion. Because it's in the news. People know about it. They care about it. They connect groundwater issues to climate change. That's a good thing.
Maybe to be a little provocative, I would like to turn it around in a way to say that sometimes also climate change is being used to cover up all the other issues that are related to water management. So it becomes like a scapegoat, or what do you say, a reason for not doing anything in a way. And many times the issues are related to governance and so on, and the drought that might be a problem because of climate change or whatever. It's not because of climate change, it's because the groundwater is already running out and there's no water in the river, and that's because the groundwater is taken out, or there's other connections there. So I think we also have to be a bit careful and not saying, okay, we have to solve the climate change problem. We also have to solve the problems without the climate change, even though they are linked. But I see that happening a little bit, and maybe it's a little more politically correct to get people around the table to talk about climate change, because it as you say, it brings people together. It's something that we can all discuss and so on. But we also have to realize that it's not necessarily only the key problem.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that there have been many examples where that happened, that, they just cover up the rest. But I think in particularly, that is my hope, that with moving some money from the countries that have caused climate change to countries that don't have the financial and whatever means to get out all the data we need for sustainable groundwater management and all that flow of money can also be happening because the people who cause climate change have to do something to help other people to adapt.
I was just going to add, in the policy space, certainly discussions of climate, water, food, and energy nexus is certainly something that's happening on the international stage. So I think there are people already thinking that way. I don't know if it's trickling down to the national level discussions, yes, but nexus issues are kind of, I think, the next thing that we're going to confront in the water space.
Thanks for that. I'd have to say I'm a little bit with Karen. I'm coming from a country where I would say we're dominantly not climate deniers, but yet you don't see the extreme at least population size and area-wise, extreme impacts that you see in some other countries, maybe it sets this up. But I've often said, so I agree, it's about windows of opportunity and seeing that the link to climate change is important. But from my point of view, and again, maybe this is me over the last 20 years not changing it, is climate change just exacerbates, for Canadians anyway, the problems we already have. So if you were to go to WHO and just plot population growth with stationarity in place, you would see that a lot of the problems that we're talking about exist. So these problems that we're dealing with haven't arrived because of climate change. For most of us, they're just more acute. So it's the acuteness, the event-based things that really, so for, I don't know, Dave, if you've seen that way, but for us, it's really about how it exacerbates it. So the flip side of that challenge that we're experiencing on the Canadian side is all the political attention and the funding is on climate mitigation. It's about greenhouse gas mitigation and not yet very much attention on forwarding proactively the adaptation side. So for us, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So other thoughts on how climate change affects the dairy industry? Do they talk about it that way, or do they not? That's just a bad storm last month.
We certainly do talk about climate change in the dairy industry. Not so much in the context that you're addressing it in, but I think it's an important factor, and perhaps, without going into it in too much detail, I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is, as we develop either technologies or management practices, education programs, various things that we hope will improve our performance, that we are thinking about a little more broadly than just water supply and water quality, although those are quite broad to start with, but that we look for things that will also consider the impacts or insulation of us from climate change, from air quality, various other cross-media types of impacts. We've made a lot of decisions over the years to do this for this reason, and there's been pluses and minuses and trade-offs, and I think as we move forward, we need to be a little more cognizant than we have in the past of what the trade-offs really are as we change a management practice. What is it going to do to land use? What is it going to do to local and environmental impacts? What does it do, at least in our industry, for animal welfare? Those kinds of things have to be a little more thoroughly considered before we make a big change.
Great. Thanks. Other thoughts at the back in terms of either big observations or things you think we should do?
This is a little bit of an aha, I guess, the panelists actually.
Can I have?
Came from the question about don't waste a good crisis, but I think we actually waste a good crisis all the time. And it goes back to the social norms. So there's a couple of ways to control social norms. One is policy and the other is scarcity. And scarcity is when we have a crisis. But when that scarcity goes away, we all revert back to the old social norm. And somehow as policymakers and scientists, it's, how do we actually maintain that changed social norm so that the next time we hit the crisis, it's not going to be severe. But we don't do that very well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in California. When this crisis goes away, that it comes back again.
Sorry, at the back.
I'd like to get some comments. We talk about environmental. Is this working? And we talk about environmental impacts, and we just talked about mitigation and all of that, and we've talked about crises management. And it seems that maybe what's missing is a clearer definition of the benefits. I mean, Sigma talks about the it was referred to today in one of the talks as the 6 deadly sins, but it's a negative way of presenting it. It's the 6 big opportunities, and so all these things affect livelihood typically, the livelihood of the status quo, And so it seems that in discussion of what's missing is how does it help improve the livelihood, and how does it, and where are those benefits felt? And like instead of like environmental impact reports, why don't we have environmental benefit reports, or things like that? And I'll take that.
And over here, any response while we're moving the mic from our group here?
Hi, I want to share an impression, and it's in the same line that Phil has said. We have been talking about best management practices in agriculture, but nevertheless the water table and the water storage is going down dramatically. So for me it's a paradox that we are talking a lot, have been talking here a lot about revenues, about economical profit, which is good, that is necessary, but not too much about conservancy, environmental conservancy. I think that the conference has been somehow, and that's not a criticism, biased to that point. And I am afraid that this reflects, perhaps, the political approach to the problem. I mean, going to the economical part and somehow setting apart all the environmental aspects that should come from hydrological recovery and so on, of all 6 commandments. That will be I think there is a final conservation and environmental goal to reach. And this goal has been somehow not mentioned too much in this conference.
All right. That's really helpful. And what I'll put back to you, you can let him keep the microphone for a second, because I want to give you a chance to respond if you want, or the group. In the vein of the conversation, it's sort of like, what are we trying to get to? Would you say should the goal of a discussion or a conversation be about how do we do conservation, or is it a goal about the thing that we think conservation gets us? So really, what is the goal conservation, or is the goal sustainable management or intergenerational equity? And I share with Dave my experience with First Nations in Canada. Look at it from automatically, it's about a 7 generation going forward. So is conservation the goal, or is there something else you want to see us get at that we talk about conservation?
I will not be very good on doing word playings. I mean, but the...
I don't know, but I just love the accent anyway, so just go.
That environmental goals should be put in the first line, as well as financial or economical goals. If not, probably we are missing something. And I'm saying this because of the experience of the Water Framework Directive, which has been mentioned today. I mean, the environmental, the ecological status of rivers and estuaries and seawater is taking one of the main achievements for a good management of the water resources. And this is the point I miss it along this conference. Right. I don't know, it's my first contact about the Sigma. So right. Probably I'm not well informed, but I wanted to share this impression.
No, that's really helpful. Can I ask some of the panelists up to maybe take that up, because I think that comes up a lot about either your experience of the way it is framed or should be framed in terms of sort of clarity of the goals that are both economic and environmental and sort of broad or sociological. We can have our 3 pillars, because I think what I find people are not successful but more sensitive to is what we heard a lot, is that the lack of entering the conversation, particularly with the producer community, and it happens to be agriculture here, but entering the conversation with a sensitivity that the producer group has the same values and hopes for their children and their country that you do, but they have to work within an economic space. And you have to actually acknowledge that before you get into the rest of the conversation. But what you're saying is that when we err to that, do we actually see that the other sort of obvious sort of environmental and social goals are clearly? So from your experience, are those things articulated in examples that you know of, or is that one of the challenges?
I can only speak from the Australian experience, but so there's 2 examples I could give. So in the Murray-Darling Basin, we had a Water Act, and it tried to put environment first. And we created a number based on that. There was the sustainable yield for the basin, and then everybody got upset and said, you can't put the environment first. It has to be balanced. And so then we went back and we created a much smaller number where it was balanced with society and economics. The way for me, I might share your feeling a little bit. I don't fully understand how Sigma's going to work with those 6 things. Is it going to produce a number that's like a sustainable yield, or what have you? So in Australia, the government just said, here's our model. We'll talk to you about it for a bit, but this is going to be the sustainable yield for each of your basins, and your licenses are going to be cut by 75%, 50%, 95%. We'll give you some compensation for that, and we'll ratchet it down slowly, but that's what you need to be sustainable. And so that's kind of the very top-down model I come from, and so I'm interested to see how Sigma will work, and I'd welcome comments on how those 6 things are going to be translated into sustainability.
It's awful difficult to bring the environment in after the fact. I guess you might be able to speak about South Africa, which actually had a chance to start over, developed what's considered one of the world's most progressive environmental acts, and my understanding is it's had a heck of a time trying to implement that. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, Karen.
I guess what needs to be said in this respect is that when you create a legal or framework for the groundwater, for water more general, it has to be something that is achievable and realistic. And maybe it was in the case of Australia, and you have, I think, achieved a lot and come a long way. The other example is maybe South Africa, where they also have like a very ideal water law, where they have put environment and domestic needs at the very top of the goals of achieving water sustainability, and then only later other uses should be covered for industry and agriculture and so on. And it has been very, very difficult to implement. So in reality, you sometimes see the whole thing flipped around. So you get industry as a first receiver of the water, and then you get the agriculture, and then only at the very bottom you get the poor people, and at the end of the day there's nothing for the environment. So it's also very delicate to get these things right from the beginning. I mean, it's very nice to have something that is idealistic and so on, but then how do you actually implement it? Because at the end of the day, if you have a law that's actually too idealistic and not very achievable, then you're up against very poor odds in terms of implementing it, because it just becomes like a restriction at the end of the day, and it becomes a fighting and so on. So maybe what could be learned from this is that it's better to have a law that is maybe less stringent, but something that is achievable, and then in an iterative way increase the goals and what you want to achieve. But I think I agree with the kind of observations that you have, that in the Sigma there's no really, it's not tangible, and I don't like the way that it's framed, that it's to avoid something. I don't think that's a way to have a goal. A goal should be to achieve something positively, not to avoid something. But it's kind of the way that it's been framed. It's very difficult to put something very tangible around it.
I don't think I'm going to talk about Sigma, but just in general, one thing that I really liked about this conference that what didn't happen last time is there were some really excellent presentations from the Almond Board of California, from Perry Clausen's group, and I was given the opportunity to talk about what the California dairy industry is doing to kind of address water quality, water conservation, and we're seeing a lot of effort happening, and a lot more discussion of it, and I think that's evolved a lot in the last 6 years. I know I've seen some really positive work done over at the Almond Board, and Gabrielle gave a fantastic presentation about that. So it's good to see that happening. It's good to see the discussion happening inside the grower community and being supported by the research community. As I mentioned earlier on, we've done so much more in the last few years than we have in the past to really try to figure out what we can do about these issues. And I think irrigated agriculture in general in California is kind of new to the party, but we're already seeing, as Perry's presentation showed us, some real organized efforts to get after this stuff and make improvements and get education and outreach to the growers. So I have some pretty positive feelings about that change, and I think if we can keep that kind of progress up, we'll probably have some good news to report the next time we come back.
I'm going to take one at the back, and then privilege goes to Thomas.
So I had a bit of an aha moment that follows just on with this. So several years ago, back in 2011, just not long after I got my PhD, we got a funding from the National Science Foundation's Water Sustainability and Climate Program to do work in the High Plains Aquifer. So we went out to visit people, including growers, and the first thing I was told was, well, don't talk about sustainability and don't talk about climate change. So immediately it was like, well, what do we talk about? So mostly we just listened. And so I was listening, referencing again Gabrielle's talk, I was listening to her talking about a yearly survey that they send out called the California Almond Sustainability Program or something like that. So the language is completely different, and it struck me that the almond growers are no less dependent on irrigation water from the ground than the folks are in many parts of the High Plains. And so so the aha was, oh yeah, this is a cultural thing as much as anything. And also an interesting side note to that is all these different laboratories for the sustainability plans offer a chance for scientists to really become involved at a level to really show what can work, so that when the culture shifts in places that are maybe a little more recalcitrant, we can be there to help provide information there too.
Thanks for that. Any thoughts on? It's good to hear that, and the take home there for anybody who's done this is the first thing you do is listen, and the rest of the conversation always comes out better if you start there, because when listening leads to a conversation, which leads to trust, which doesn't necessarily mean an agreement, but it means that the conversation happens. So I'm glad to hear that it's going that way. So thanks, Thomas. I think I promised you.
Maybe an observation across both the last conference and this conference. One of the aha moments for me in the last conference was that learning from conversations and presentations from around the world that a big change locally was always affected foremost locally when there was a local leader, somebody who stepped up and said, we got to do something about this problem. And as a neutral party and as a cheerleader, more than anything else, rallied around the community to get engaged and make things change. And in looking at the last 10 years and where we've come to in California, and this speaks to a number of things that were said, the observation that was just made about let's not talk about sustainability and sustainable management, JP's observation, how ag has gotten very engaged in this. Looking at it, it's in California a tandem of a number of things that has gotten us to where we are. And this is also an answer to your question about, why did Sigma happen? There were a number of things that drove Sigma, and the drought was one. Stanford Investment Fund buying almond orchards and drilling deep wells was another. But a big piece of it was that we've had these conversations again and again, every time in crisis. We build more capacity each time, educational capacity and outreach capacity, which I've been part of, but also the capacity in districts to think about groundwater management as we build groundwater management plans, having more conversations and more conversations. And the fact that we have these agricultural coalitions that put leaders like JP and Gabrielle and Perry Klassen in front of a vehicle where they're part of the learning environment as much as they're part of the leading environment, there's huge value to what you just said, which is you guys actually have the toughest jobs talking to your growers, and it's different. You guys play a different role from what we in Extension do, and especially my farm advisor colleagues. We're advisors, but we're not an inside job. You guys are much more of an inside job because your growers have bought into you to make they pay money so that you can give them success in a different way from how we as farm advisors and extension agents can do that. And that has really changed the ballgame. And there's a lot of learning going on, and that learning cannot be underestimated. And it's going both ways. We're learning. You guys are learning. Policymakers are learning. And then there's, at a higher level, there is leadership that has sort of greased the skids in California. I remember Lester Snow walking into the room 6 years ago, 2009 or 2010, and saying, the last drought is over. The 2007-2009 drought was over, but the next drought is going to come. What are we going to do? And we had a dead honest conversation about this among a bunch of water leaders from around the state. What are we going to do when that next crisis comes? What is it that we want to affect about groundwater? And that conversation, among others, facilitated a strategic planning in Association of California Water Agencies. They came up with a strategic groundwater plan, which was another piece that helped move towards Sigma. And it's those leadership faces that all together, not one at a time, but all together, I think have gotten us to where we are. And I think there's a big piece, and I've heard this many times at this conference, that community engagement and that leadership is a very critical part.
So I think, Thomas, you just answered my first question about how do you deal with crisis management, which is when you're in one crisis, you plan, and that is you plan for the next. Yeah.
Just one additional observation is I do think we tend to sometimes be pessimistic, but the exact types of things I saw in the presentations from Perry, from the Almond Board, and there was another really great presentation from the California rice industry. And I have the perspective of having worked for them more than 20 years ago now. While those problems were newer and much worse, and what I think I saw today was really a fantastic success story of what the rice industry has done to get ahead of water quality issues, to characterize what their groundwater situation is as well, and many other things that they've done. And so it's just proof. And they were leaders. I was part of this back in the in the mid 90s, but it had already started even before I joined Rice, and they were really thinking ahead, planning long term, taking an honest look at what their sort of environmental balance sheet was, what their liabilities were, what their positives were, and then took about a long-term organized effort to make the most of their strengths and minimize their weaknesses, and it's paid off. Today they are doing much better as an industry, and I think people perceive them as such. So I really applaud when I see things like what the Almond Board has done and what the ILRPs are trying to do right now, and that I think there's other folks who are still struggling with the leadership role that you just described, but at least if a few brave folks step forward and take a few arrows, then maybe some more will come behind them. So.
Let me pass that to Bill, because what I'm going to do is I want to get us out of here a couple minutes early, if not on time. So just going to do sort of the whirlwind wrap-up panel. So one or two statements given this conversation. So I'm a big proponent, as Mikhail and others who know, of saying leadership is us. So I'm tired of going to meetings where people say, I wish there was leadership. There's leadership I mean, there's something about enigmatic and effective communicators and leaders that we can point to that are really important. But there's sort of a leadership role to be played by each of us, and that you can do. So I'm sort of, the lightning round is what the panel's advice, looking out, both looking in, looking to themselves and looking out. It can include Thomas and Dave if they had enough energy to do the next conference. But not only, the lightning round is, what is it you would most like to see yourself or people that you're looking at do when you leave here that you think could lead to a difference? Because everybody's got a leadership capability of sorts. So you're farthest.
All right.
Okay, Bill's going to start. Atta boy, isn't he brave among other things? He's a good author too.
You know, my experience is more involved in sort of a few international things is really the key is to go into any situation listening first and developing a sense of mutual respect, and that's kind of where you get started. And I think that that's very true. I mean, this is a huge challenge in California for people to actually. It's easier said than done, but to do that. So I guess that would be. So
what's the admonition or advice from that? Is for them to go forth, or for us to go forth and think, listen first, or how would you? What is it you would have them do? Us do?
I'm not sure in the setting you're talking, but I would say listening first.
Some of us have been working our whole life on that.
So I agree with the listening first, but I think also we have to make sure that groundwater kind of stays on the agenda at the same time. So I don't know what that is, listening and shouting in the opposite direction. And gently reminding. I think that's particularly important because, the experience from Australia is once it starts to rain, people forget. And then things start to slide away. If you've got good institutions in place, they can kind of continue along, and maybe that's okay. But if you don't progress enough, then there's a real risk of backsliding and things unwinding.
Thanks, Karen. I don't think if Jay is still here, but I've seen in a few different presentations now people using that slide of the hydroecological cycle, right? It's like drought, whatever, panic, freak out, and all the other things, and then rains and starts again. So.
To say something wise at the end. I think I would end by saying that I would love to come back in 6 years and see what has happened here in California and follow the progress. And it's a great privilege to have been here and be part of this scene. And I'll also go back and keep working on groundwater. We have just started this groundwater Solutions Initiative for Policy and Practice, GRIP. Maybe you've seen the poster and so on, but if not, I encourage you to pick up a brochure and a concept note and have a look at that. So what this is a global initiative for groundwater, for sustainable groundwater management, and I'm sticking out my own person here as one who's trying to advocate for that and bringing people together in this kind of partnership. And I've already talked to quite a few of you, and there's a bit of interest, or a lot of interest around this, I think. So sort of sharing knowledge and having a partnership which brings the knowledge together and, as you said, can shout groundwater whenever it's needed at the different occasions and meetings and whatever, and also to bring knowledge out that we all have, but in a way that is kind of accessible and understandable for like policymakers and so on. So that's kind of some of the objectives of this GRIP, and I would welcome you to have a look at it, and we can keep the discussion going on some of these things, and then see you back in 6 years. Thank you.
So JP, you got 60 seconds of fire for us, and then we can finish on time.
So I think what I'm going to do is think very hard about what presentation I would like to make at the next conference, what message it would like to carry, and what it has to get done to make that message be what I want it to be, and also what our technical people do as well, so that we have some good. And that would be my advice to other folks if they want some change, to take steps in the next couple of days to start those processes in motion, so that we all have positive news to report next time around.
Thanks for that. And again, I would say to with gratitude to Thomas and to Dave and the organizers. That last comment, from my experience, speaks to the fact that the value of the trust in and the value of the conversation. So if the response is, I want to come back here and make sure I bring my message, that speaks to finding value in this group. And that, for me, that's a metric right there. So I want to have you all join me in sort of jointly thanking the organizers for this event, thanking our panel, and thanking yourselves. So. I think that makes it a wrap. So, go forth, listen well, shout effectively, and travel safe.